Hey everyone, welcome to Reddit Readout. Today we are checking out malicious compliance. Story 1. Need me to stay back and cover a shift? This will cost you big time. This comes from about 15 plus years ago, when I was, and still am, working with people with disabilities in a community home. It's a great job for those who like it, a terrible one for those who don't, meaning that any staff you meet are either very new, or long-term like myself. As a consequence, the turnover rate of staff is high, and replacement staff are slow to be hired, meaning, you often find shifts not covered straight away. This is an industry where simply not having a shift filled isn't an option, particularly where I work, in a house with a single day staff, and a single night staff. Each working 12 shifts on a 7-day spread over 2 weeks roster. There are some strict rules regarding hours you can work. Intended to avoid burnout, but more used to keep a reign of overtime, which, in our industry, paid plus 70% your hourly rate for the first 3 hours above your 76-hour fortnightly maximum, and plus 100% for any time after that. You can't demand overtime, but if they require you to work longer, they can't not pay you overtime. Also worth noting is that the people we work with are vulnerable, meaning they cannot be left unsupervised. Long story short, you can't go home until your replacement arrives. So back in the early 2000s we were having problems locating staff, lots of people working overtime and a lot of fresh faces appearing and disappearing. The house I worked in wasn't difficult in particular for adults with intellectual disability, but there was no support, by which I mean the worker there had to fend for themselves. There was no supervisor in the next building, they were miles and miles away. I'd frequently at this time had to stay back half an hour, waiting for staff to come replace me. I was less than happy with the way it was handled. Each time I called the office to tell them the night staff haven't arrived, do you know who is booked? To which I'd get the reply, we are still looking, how late can you stay? The obvious answer was until I'm replaced, but what I often said was I prefer not to stay after the end of my shift, but that doesn't seem to matter now, so I'll stay here until someone comes. Each time a new face arrived, I'd give them all the information they'd need for the shift, introduce them, walk them through their duties, etc. This would take 20 to 30 minutes. The point being is I don't just jump ship when a staff arrives to replace me. This is someone's home, and I like them, so I'm not going to leave them in the hands of someone uninformed. Cut to that weekend. My roster had me working 12-hour days Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Come Friday night, my replacement didn't arrive. I waited. I sent a text message to the supervisor after 15 minutes, then called after 30. Left a message, and when they eventually called back I could tell they had not found a replacement. I told them I'd stay until they did. This was by that time, an hour after I was meant to finish. 10 p.m. Come 11 they call and say they simply can't find a replacement. They offer a deal and say if I stay and do the night shift, I can take the next shift off. It's pretty even, so you won't miss out, they said. Then they changed their tone and said, it's not really a request, we have no other option. Treat this as a direction. I reminded them it was a passive house, meaning you got half the hourly rate from midnight, but you could sleep in the bed provided, so I'd actually be taking a pay cut. They didn't know what else they could do, so I made a suggestion. I'd stay and do the night shift, but I wasn't going to give up my next shift. I was going to do that one as well. They agreed. It meant they didn't need to find a replacement for me in the morning, so they thought it was a good deal for them. It was, however, an even better deal for me. It took a few emails over the weekend with the union to sort out the particulars, but what happened was this. Once I couldn't leave my worksite because of a lack of replacement, I was on overtime. As this overtime was because of a direction, not voluntary, it remained in place until I went home. Because I didn't agree to drop my following day shift, my overtime continued till I ended on Saturday night. The upshot being that, working 36 hours in a row, resulted in the equivalent of 60 hours pay. I was the first person to, as they say, pull this stunt, and word got around that if you didn't get replaced you were actually the person who was in a position of power. It didn't take long until the department put a little more effort into training and employing extra staff, so something like this never happened again. Not at least, to me. Story 2. I'm not a volunteer, okay? In the 1990s I was a college student studying botany. A local botanical garden sponsored a plant sale every year, which brought in dozens of vendors of rare and native plants and probably upwards of 1,000 plant fanatics. People would drop thousands of dollars on plants at this sale. The botanic garden had a volunteer policy that was basically work for 2 hours helping at the sale and you get in a half hour before the general public. I seldom bought anything, but I knew and chatted with several of the vendors, and it was nice to peruse without the insane crush of people. The mostly elderly volunteers did various tasks like man the cash registers and information booth, and the younger ones like me would set up tables or help people carry out their purchases. One year I discovered that I was really fast at assembling boxes. The botanic garden had boxes printed just for the sale, they were basically cardboard flats for carrying plants. At some point I started coming 2 hours early just to put together boxes. I would do 20 while others were struggling to make one. By the end of 2 hours, I would have a huge stack of boxes that would last through most of the sale. The last year I volunteered, there was a new person in charge of the volunteers. When I showed up and started putting together boxes, she came up to me and said, "What are you doing?" "I'm putting together boxes." "You're not on the list." "There's a list?" "I'm just a volunteer." Volunteers are required to work 8 hours in the garden every year, and I've never seen you before. This was news to me, having been doing the same thing for several years with no issues. Seemed suspicious considering most of the volunteers were in their 70s or 80s. I had encountered this type of person before, so I knew better than to try to debate policy. "Well, okay," I said, dropping the box I was putting together and walking to the back of the line of people waiting to get in. I had only been there long enough to put about a dozen boxes together. The stacks of unassembled boxes sat there and no one came to put them together. After the tiny stack of boxes was gone, people had to put together their own boxes and they were pissed. The line went really slow as every person had to stop and make their own box. A minor inconvenience multiplied by 1,000 people becomes a real problem. I'm just sorry that the public had to bear the brunt of it. Story 3. Toggle the bathroom sign, the pettiest of compliance. I, male, work in a small building where, of 20 employees, there are 3 other men. The men's room has 4 urinals and 3 stalls, plenty of room for everyone if needed. There's also a unisex executive bathroom. 2 of the other men are executives, CEO, CFO. As part of COVID protocols, every bathroom had vacant/occupied toggle signs installed. They're on the bathroom door to the whole bathroom, not the stalls. It was, in 2020, an understandable measure to prevent exposure to an unknown virus in a poorly ventilated enclosed space. It is not as necessary now, especially since we're all vaxxed and, there are 4 of us. Generally speaking, I don't use the toggle, it's a relic. Some combination of the other men do use the toggle, switch it to occupied on their way in and don't change it back to vacant on their way out. Our CEO, who does not use the executive bathroom for whatever reason, is also the chief executive offender. He insists that the toggle remain due to COVID protocols. Whatever, any bathroom is 95% never in use, so I go in anyway, ignoring the sign. Last week the CEO denied a request to move to more WFH days over the summer, a period of lighter workload. I'll live, but it's annoying. This week a sign showed up inside the bathroom saying make sure to flip the sign, more or less. Meaning that not only are the signs still up, but the CEO wants their use enforced. For COVID reasons. And we can't WFH. Here's the malicious compliance, I am now using the sign. Every time I've gone in the bathroom I toggle it from occupied to vacant and toggle it back to occupied when I leave. I hope it makes our CEO wait a few extra minutes with a full bladder. Bonus for r/petty revenge overlap, if the executives aren't going to use their private bathroom, I am. I had a nice long sit-down session this afternoon. TLDR, I toggle the toggle so every day is opposite day. Story 4. The one where my grandfather obeys his mother. I recently remembered a story my grandfather told me years ago. Many moons ago, when he was a young lad, he went out with friends on Saturday, as you do. The hours went by, resulting in him straggling in at home on Sunday morning, as sometimes happens. His mother, my great-grandmother, was understandably none too pleased. "You are bringing shame on us coming home at this hour. You are meeting the good people going to church rambling home. Don't do it again," she said. My grandfather obliged. Of course he didn't want to upset his mother by meeting the churchgoers while coming home from a night out. So the next weekend, he came home on Sunday afternoon. Story 5. Subway Ops Manager, you can't get rid of it, you have to use that no matter what. Vague title but shout out to all my Subway friends. Our story begins at a previous job, Subway. One of our sister stores had shut down and they were offloading various equipment to other stores. We ended up getting their bread rack. These things aren't the biggest, but we didn't have a big store, and we already had one. So we have this overflowing backroom with 2 bread racks, one partially blocking the fire exit. I was getting more and more annoyed, when finally, a few days later I asked him one more time, "So we absolutely have to use it?" And Bob, manager, looks at me like I ate crayons for breakfast and said, "I already told you that." Well, if I have to use it, I was never told how I had to use it. Cue malicious compliance. I waited until Bob left for the day, then the fun began. For starters, I made a spot against the wall that would fit our bread rack. I unscrewed the glass door, then took out all the shelving units, then even the metal guide racks on the sides. I then threw in some empty bread trays and a few of the guide racks back and converted it from a bread rack to a miscellaneous storage rack. It actually looked pretty good. Bob wasn't back around to our store for another few days, but when he returned, Bob goes to the back, starts doing his weekly checklist, and then stops at the bread rack turned storage cabinet. He turns around and goes, "Who the hell did this?" My coworker and I shared a very cheeky grin. I owned it and said I did. He asks why, looking all the world like he was ready to write me up. I politely informed Bob that I had asked to get rid of it. He had told me multiple times to use the bread rack no matter what. He shakes his head in disappointment and goes back to his list, and we go back to our usual sandwich shenanigans. A few days later, our impromptu storage rack had inexplicably disappeared, and Bob was much more careful about how he chose his wording from then on. That's all for today. Please don't forget to like and subscribe.